Welcome, everybody. So while the last few people who come in are still settling in, I want to welcome everyone who's here. My name is Alexa Weik from Mossner. I teach this lecture class. We have the great pleasure today of hosting in this lecture on American culture, history, and society our distinguished Fulbright professor, Dr. Claudia Ford. I want to thank very much Fulbright for making this possible, for the generous support. I'm glad that so many people have joined us here in the room and also are joining us online. So we are streaming this at the same time, and there will also be a recording, fingers crossed, that will later be available to everyone. Without much ado, I want to give the floor to my dear colleague, Eva-Maria Trinkaus, who is going to introduce Claudia.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and thank you, everybody online, for joining us as well. I would like to thank Fulbright, the Department of English at the University of Klagenfurt, of course, Alexa, and the IT staff and the secretary for making this event possible. It's fantastic to have a full room, and it's also fantastic to have quite a significant number of people joining us online who are interested in Claudia's fantastic research, which we're going to hear about in a little bit. I know that for some of you, there's quite a big time difference, so we definitely appreciate that you're participating in this lecture. As Alexa has already said, my name is Eva-Maria Trinkaus. I have the great honor, but also the great pleasure of introducing Professor Claudia Ford, our esteemed Fulbright professor at the department, to you today, and she is staying with us for the summer term. Claudia Ford is and I have to look at my cheat sheet here a little bit. Claudia Ford is a professor of environmental studies at SUNY Potsdam, as well as a fellow of the panel of planetary thinking at Justus Liebig University in Gießen in Germany, and a research professor at the University of Buffalo. Is that correct? Yes. You may know that Claudia has quite a multidisciplinary background with degrees in biology, in medicine, in business administration, in fine arts, and in environmental studies, where she also holds a PhD. And she has published several books, beautiful essays, and numerous articles in renowned international journals. Among those, and I'm singling one out, is a textbook called Introduction to Environmental Studies from 2022. This is not her latest publication by all means, but it highlights her dedication to teaching, which is also why she's joining us here in Klagenfurt. And for us here at the University of Klagenfurt, her expertise in US American literary and cultural studies with a focus on the environment is really significant because it is reflected in her teaching for BA and MA students in 2 classes. On top of teaching those 2 classes, it's fantastic that you're also sharing your research with us. And it's a special treat for all of us that we're going to listen to your talk, American History and the Secret Life of Medicinal Plants, Archives, Ethnobotany, and Environmental Justice. I hope you're looking forward to this as much as I am. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Hi, everybody. I would really like to thank Professors Weik and Mossner and Professor Trinkaus, and I want to thank the university, especially the Department of English, and my colleagues in American Studies and Linguistics who have been so kind and very patient with me. I'd also like to thank Fulbright Austria for this opportunity, and my colleagues back home. I'm really glad that you mentioned our textbook, which I wrote with 2 of my colleagues at SUNY Potsdam, and so I could not do that work without doing it with a lot of team support, if you will. I also would like to thank my American colleagues who got up at 5:30 this morning to join us, so welcome. A shout out to my research supervisor, Dr. Maltz, who I know is online, and to my plant medicine teacher, Deb Soul. So I'm very glad that you could join us. And finally, I would like to thank my students here, especially for their patience with me and my slowness with technology. I think when I explained that I was born before color TV, they're a little bit more understanding about why every single class I'm struggling with the projector and Moodle system. So I thank them for that very, very much. Let's get started. I would like to start by kind of telling you how this research works. And there are a couple of things that I would like to say. The first thing is, please don't worry about having to take pictures of the slides or frantically take notes. I want you to think of this as a story, because it is a story. It's history. And so the history discipline tends to be about stories. But this research specifically is very much about stories. And so, with apologies to LeVar Burton, this is Reading Rainbow for academics. And what that means is I want you to sit back and listen to the story itself, because that's a very important part of my research. What that means is I will make this PowerPoint presentation available to you. And if you're doing research in this field, please contact me. I am happy to share my bibliographies with you. Do make note of questions if you have any. The other thing that I would like to say is, as you have heard, I am one of those people who likes to work across disciplinary boundaries, right? So when we think probably in high school and college about what we're going to do with our career, and the phrase that they say in the United States is you climb the ladder of your career, right? And for me, I kept saying, but which wall is this ladder supposed to be on? And so, in fact, you will see from this research that I have always moved my ladder, if you will, around to different walls. And that's because I have a restless mind that very much likes to address a problem from different angles. So I like to go deeply into these subject matters here. We're going to hear about medicine, history, ethnobotany, medicinal plants, and I like to go into them and figure out, where do they cross? Where do they talk to each other? So you will definitely hear that. The other thing is, I'm going to somewhat start with the conclusion, so that the story that you're about to hear will be, how did I get there? So the why for me was, I was interested in this particular time in American history, when 1700s, 1800s, you had very traumatic events with indigenous Americans, and I'll use the term both indigenous and Native American. They are not identical, but I will use both. And then you had Africans who were becoming African Americans, and you may also hear me call them Black Americans, who were being forcibly brought to the continent. And then you had Europeans who were coming, many of them from trauma themselves, and they were coming to the Americas and then reenacting some of that trauma in the way that they were establishing this new country. And I was very interested in what was going on in the 17 and 1800s in the United States of America. I was very specifically interested in how these groups in these very fraught situations communicated with each other. And I was very interested in retention of knowledge. So you have groups who are traumatized, and we'll often talk about African retention of knowledge through the Middle Passage, through enslavement. And there's a lot of research that's been done about food and about music and about religion. And I was interested in what about the knowledge of plant medicine had been retained. So that's a little bit of coming to the why, and also to the conclusion is that, in fact, these groups were talking to each other. And so now let me present you with how I got to that position. What you'll also notice is, as you heard, I have a degree in fine arts, and I'm also an artist. I have a studio and a studio practice, and I really like to honor the work of artists. Here, I very specifically, as you'll see on the slides, I looked for the work of women artists, from all three communities that I'm talking about, or all three populations, as far back as I could go, both because their work would speak to the time that I'm talking about, but also looking for things that are in the public domain. That was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed that. But the other thing about putting artwork into my presentations is that I myself am a visual learner. And so I'm also, as I'm taking in this incredible amount of information, I'm using the artwork to kind of, what's the word, accept it at a different level, to understand it in a different way. So I invite you into that part of the presentation as well. So my research is about how medicinal plants were used for women's reproductive health in the 16th through 20th centuries in North America. And this is what you're about to hear. I'm interested in the historical knowledge of these plants that were specific to women's experiences of menstruation, menopause, pregnancy, childbirth, the postpartum, afterbirth period, from the delivery of the placenta through to what's called involution. What does that mean? It means the time when the uterus after birth goes back to its normal and pre-pregnancy size. And it also includes the infant and breastfeeding. And so for all of these periods at this time, plant medicines were used. And we have to remember that this is a time when plant medicines were it. That's all we had, right? 1800s, all of us, all of our communities were using medicinal plants. You'll also hear from this presentation that I'm a midwife. I don't have a practice now, but I did right after college. I delivered babies for about 5 years in California, delivered 250 babies. And so a lot of my interest and knowledge and passion about this topic comes from my direct experience of that. And I thank the midwives who helped me to understand both the reproductive health, but also the use of plant medicines. And what I'm looking at is how is this knowledge retained, but also how is it shared? And I call this negotiated epistemology. That means the sharing of knowledge about the use of medicinal plants, remembering that for indigenous Americans, they were living with these plants. In some cases, they had been living on the land for 12 to 14,000 years, from what the archaeological record says. Europeans were bringing their plants with them, and that was the established process. You would bring your seeds with you, and you would set up a kitchen garden. And what we can tell is that Africans were also bringing plants with them, both in the provisioning of the ships, but also some of them had the foresight to gather seeds before they got on the ships and to bring the seeds with them. So you bringing your seeds that you know you're going to need for the health of yourself, your family, your community, but you're also bringing all the knowledge that you have to use those. So how does this information sharing among these communities was one of the key questions that I had. How did I find this out? Well, I had to look in the archives, and I was very, very fortunate at this point to be in archives in Connecticut and on tribal land, so the Mohegan and the Mashantucket Pequot tribal archives, some of which are just fantastic researches. But I spent about 18 months regularly going into the library and having the library bring me tons of books, and it was a fabulous experience for me. And that's the part of me that's the historian and the detective. But this was an important part of this is I have to get this information from the archives. And you're going to hear in a second, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that process is like. And so how is this knowledge passed? Again, this was the most important part of this research is how do we share this important information across these groups that were encountering each other in so many fraught ways and in such cultural differences between them. And yet this information was being shared. I feel it's important to say that historical research always has this problem of you're doing the research now about the time that happened before. And this is no more true around the issue of gender. So I'm talking about women's health, I'm talking about women's reproductive health. And I was reading and researching about a time when the binary was very much the underlying foundation for how it was spoken about. I don't believe in that. And I really do understand gender on a spectrum, but I just want you to know that that was one of the things in reading the archives that I had to keep in mind. The other thing is that the terminology was quite different. So if I was reading, for example, about the uterus or the womb, our understanding today, reading about that, was not the understanding that the people writing that had. And so these are interesting things about working in archives that we must keep in mind. But I want to start with why plants, okay? Why and what is it about plant humanities, plant studies, critical plant studies that's so important? Why? How can we use the knowledge of plants to talk about communications through history? And the why plants for me is because I love plants. My grandmother was a plant person. I'm very interested and always have been in plant medicine. But I thought, let's just think about this for a second. Within the last 15 to 20 years, plant studies has exploded. The research has really taken off in so many different directions that there's no way I can even present all of the ways that there have been plant studies in the environmental humanities, yes, but in all other fields, anthropology, ethnobotany, botany itself. We are learning so much about plant life. And so it's been a pleasure to look at this work of critical plant studies. What is critical plant studies? I have it located here under environmental humanities, but as I said, it can be located in many different places. But it's mostly looking at this relationship between plants and people. It's also looking at plant behavior, the agency of plants, what's called plant poetics, which means the way in which plants are represented in our fine arts. And all of these topics have really exploded. And I think some of my colleagues in the field of critical plant studies broadly have joined us today, and I welcome them. And what we have learned in this kind of last decade, 15 years, is that plants exhibit a very sophisticated form of communication, both interspecies and across species. A lot of us hear about the mycelial networks and the ways that trees talk to each other, and there's an infection in one tree and it's communicated to a different part of the forest through the underground, through the roots, and the mycelia attached to the roots. I mean, just amazing things. And in that case, there's one piece of research that says one plant will produce a substance that is ultimately harmful to the potential predator or attracts the potential predator of the organism that is causing the infection in another plant. Right? So if you start to think about it, it's like, wow, even people don't necessarily communicate that well, as we saw during the pandemic. Plants communicate with each other through biochemical cues, through their roots. They produce substance, and this is Michael Marder's research, that are similar to the painkillers that we produce. They can distinguish colors. All of this to me is just kind of says, this is why plants, because plants are fascinating, and plants really do tell us something about our relationship with the plants. This was my favorite. I had to put this in here. This is from 2023. Inquirvaillia was reporting about a study. It was in the New York Times. And because of the sophistication of our technology, the researchers here were actually able to distinguish the cries of plants. Not only were the plants complaining about being dry, which of course as a plant parent made me feel really bad, because I don't know about you, but sometimes, yeah. And they were complaining differently about being not getting enough water than they were about being cut. So again, for me, it was like, wow, this is really interesting. I'm so glad that our technology allows us to see this. But the other reason this is important for me is because science catches up with what traditional ecological knowledge, sometimes called folklore, traditional knowledge has always known. So if you look at the knowledge of indigenous peoples, they have always regarded plants in this way of having a lot of agency and did not need the scientific studies. And so in many ways, I love the scientific studies, but we are, as scientists, catching up to knowledge that has already existed in human society. And that's another reason why plants are so important. So moving on in this research, and yes, you will notice that some of the artwork is my own work. I'm more than happy to present some of my collage as well. And this is one of the pieces. But okay, what does this mean about negotiated epistemologies? In other words, the negotiations that must happen as we are sharing knowledge during this important time in American history. I'm going to look briefly at the archives themselves and the challenges that I faced in looking at this material. I'm going to go back a little bit more into what is ethnobotany, and then I'm going to end by talking about health justice. And the reason I'm doing each of these is, especially for the last two, I'm going to present the specific story of two plants. One is blue cohosh and the other is cotton. Now, my research involved almost 600 plants, and I have a database of information about those plants. But there are two of them that I want to share with you today. So let's look some more about what are archives. Archives are the actual records. Sometimes the archives are the building that they're in. Sometimes they're the agency responsible for holding these historical documents. And in this case, archival research, especially around indigenous and African American communities, was very difficult, right? You really had to consider, and around the issues facing women, because most of the archives are not authored by these people. So there's this constant dialogue that I'm having with myself and the material about how to read the archives. The archives are important because they're reflective of the power of the time in which they were engaged, in which they were assembled. And so they're not neutral, right? They're library materials, but they are not neutral. You must go into the archives, especially on a subject like this, recognizing that you're investigating the assembly of these archives as well. And so for archival material in ethnobotany, you're also looking at science, botany, pharmacy, gardening, trade. Remember that one of the biggest impetus for the age of empire were Europeans getting on ships and going to look for green gold. That they always had somebody on the ship's doctor, or a ship's surgeon, they would be called, somebody who had the ability to identify plant species and the desire to go and find these. This was for two reasons. One, it made economic sense, and two, there was generally a desire to find new treatment for diseases. And so this is how Kew Gardens started, right? It was because so many explorers were going out and they would bring back the specimens with them. So when you're reading these archives, you're also reading this history. This is an article I wrote about the challenges of the archives. And I reviewed dozens, if not more, of documents. I started doing this research just at the time when around the world we were digitizing historical materials. It was fabulous. It was also overwhelming. Every single one of these books was online. I could go online, pull it up right in front of my desk, do a keyword search, and find exactly what I wanted. So part of it was, which books do I look at? I looked at so many obscure botany books and written by housewives and some written by doctors, homeopathic doctors. It was fabulous, but it was a little bit overwhelming as well. And this is part of the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples. So again, you think about the voyages, the ethnographic material, the early anthropological material. The informants were the indigenous people who were using and living with these plants. And so if we respect this knowledge, we really have to cite the people who are using it. And that's not what happened at all. Okay. What actually happened is that the ethnographers would go into the community. Often they would talk to the men because that's either seemed more appropriate or that was who was available, even if it wasn't the men who were responsible for using the medicinal plants. Then they would write, and this is all in writing, they would say, well, my informant told me how to identify this plant, how to use it, how much to give, what it's for, but they're very superstitious and ignorant, so really. And then they would take the exact knowledge and write it in their own book and author it themselves. I saw that so many times, it became almost a cliche. And so this respect I'm talking about is a really important way to read the archives. We have to recognize that that respect was not there, but that this material originally belongs to the indigenous people and those unnamed informants who passed it on. And this, as Charlotte Fett says, this knowledge is this very dynamic relationship between the plant and plant species itself, the people who are using it, the community for whom it's being used. So all of this should be acknowledged. And the reminder that this knowing what plants to use for what diseases was just a part of our lives. So I often say to my students, just like I could send you into any country, tell you to go to a grocery store and please pick up some toothpaste. You would pretty much know how to find that, right? Because that's our reality today. Well, this was a time when if you were in the woods and you had a kind of a sense of what you used for headaches and what you had to use for stomach problems and what you had to use to keep a baby from crying, you would have a sense of the type of species, where it grows, and how to get that information, even in a slightly unfamiliar place. So it's very important to remember how critical plant medicine was to this particular time. And these were the questions I was asking myself about the archives. What do they tell us? What are they saying about these histories, right? It's about finding what has been lost. And this is that critical part of the archival research, which is there are silences. The voices of women, the voices of indigenous women, certainly the voices of African women, were not in those archives, with a few exceptions, most of those exceptions being later research on earlier topics. And so I was constantly asking myself that question. How do you fill those silences? How do you know? How do you account for the fact that power has been exercised within this archive itself? How do we work against these silences? Because remember, my research is about trying to figure out these particular forms of communication across different cultural groups. And how did I know which text to use? What were the limitations of these texts? These are all the questions that are facing me as I'm going through this research. And we can talk at length if you're more interested to know how I made these decisions. I'm happy to share that article with you, which also talks about this and how I made those decisions. But I just wanted to remind us of how much goes into doing archival work. There were so many limitations to this material, right? So the economic motivations of colonialism were not present in most of the materials. The racial, gender, and religious biases of the times in which these were being written and of the people who were writing these materials were not present in the archives. And yet, those biases were freely shared in what was written and passed on from one researcher to another. The medical and historical inaccuracies. There were many inaccuracies, especially about medicine, physiology, anatomy. And what I noticed as I went through is that this researcher would say something that wasn't 100% true from my understanding of it, and then I keep going and down the chain, other people were referencing that person, right? So again, the challenges of historical and archival research. And finally, a lot of what was being observed just wasn't understood. And I think it's Linda Smith, who's a Maori researcher, who says the researchers who were looking at indigenous knowledge didn't understand the language, didn't understand the practices, didn't actually know what they were looking at sometimes. And yet they would go and write a book and maybe even get some fame for saying that. We're going to see a very specific example of that just now. So the beliefs of the mostly European authors for these archival documents clashed with their own informants. And that made a really interesting situation to try to interpret this research. They were hampered by their very distinct prejudices about what they were seeing. And as I said, you would see them write, oh, but I don't think that the the Indians, they were calling them, really understand what they're doing. But I'm going to take this information anyway, and I'm going to write about it as if my own. This happened again, as I said, many, many times over. And the other thing is that African ethnobotanical practices were written about less than Native American. So there was some acknowledgement that becoming Americans, indigenous peoples on the continent were writing about plants that they were living with. So surely, yes, they must know something about this. When it came to African ethnobotanical knowledge, at the time I was writing, I think there was only one. There's now another very important volume that's been written about that, but there was very few things. It was really hard to find things. It turned out that some of the good information was what could be found in the records of the slave owners. And again, we'll talk about that in a second. And as I said, the habit of appropriation, taking this knowledge, writing your own book from it, was very swift. And I think that this part of the archival research was something that came up over and over again and was very important. And I would suggest if you do historical research or archival research now or in the future, that you really put a lot of time to think about what are you reading. They're filled with gaps and silences, as I've said. They're filled with omissions, especially for the lives of enslaved people. And we cannot fill these silences, yet we have to acknowledge them. And then I looked at the specific research of one researcher is going to come up here who said, how do we fill the silences, right? Like what methods, what theoretical methods can we use to understand what's missing in this research? So it's our consideration of how the people who are not represented might have represented themselves, right? And is there a objective? Is there a theoretical? Is there a systematic way that we can do this consideration? And this was the question I was asking myself. And so Saidia Hartman is one of those researchers who thought about this and came up with something that she calls critical fabulations. And she specifically says that this process of listening for silences and redressing the omissions of history, which is so important in research on American history, is a way to imagine the voices into being, but it has to have some basis to it. And of course, for me, because we're going back to the research being on reproductive health, one basis was my own knowledge and information about what happened during childbirth. So I used that, I used my personal knowledge to help fill these silences. And I employed critical fabulations by writing fiction, by writing creative nonfiction. I even had poetry in there that began to address what was going on in the birthing room that would have allowed these communities to talk to each other. And that really then helped to triangulate my research in a way that gave more strength to and filled the silences that developed. Let's move on to ethnobotany. And this is, again, a quick reminder of what this field is, right? So it's the study of plants in relation to their cultural use. It covers agriculture, housing, food, medicine, ritual, and ceremony. It's gathered traditionally from botany and anthropology, from ethnographic studies, from archaeological materials, and very much from field work. So if you're an ethnobotanists, a lot of ethnobotanists do ethnobotanical field work. It's so important that the first official book of medicines, the Pharmacopoeia, in the United States, 44% of the plants listed were, quote, Indian plant medicines, right? So this goes back to that idea that when you're looking at ethnobotany, you're very much looking at the traditional ecological knowledge of native peoples. There's also something called ethnogynecology, and that's the study of medicinal plants that are specifically used for women's reproductive health. And according to Siri van Ries Altschuld, it's those species that are employed in connection with the function of the diseases of the reproductive tract of human females, pregnancy, labor, and the word puerperium, which means postpartum, afterbirth. Blue cohosh. So blue cohosh is a very, very interesting herb. And it is still used today. And here I want to say, please, please do not take anything I am saying here to be used as medical advice. I encourage you to use plant medicines. And I myself employ them for my own health, for my family's health. But please get contemporary information and go to a specialist and see them. Do not take anything I say and then employ it. So blue cohosh, yes, is used today in reproductive health. It's used in the later part of pregnancy and the earlier stages of labor. And this particular plant points very convincingly to the fact that Indigenous and Europeans were talking to each other about the use of plant medicine. And so what happened was, so this story is so fascinating. So at the time, let's say late 1700s, early 1800s, European women were dying in childbirth. Why were they dying in childbirth? Because of a couple of things. One of which was there was still the practice to use another plant we're going to talk about, which is ergot. And ergot is something that causes uterine contractions, but it causes what's called tonic contractions. It can kill the baby and rupture the uterus and kill the mother. And in fact, if you look at history in most of the countries of Europe, you see that European women were dying from childbirth, but they were also dying from the use of ergot in childbirth. So when the ship doctors came over, and they saw, in fact, that Native American women were not dying in childbirth, but were, in fact, didn't like seem to be having the same problems their women were having. And you see them write things like, the squaw walked off the path into the woods and came back an hour later with a baby, right? I mean, really, they obviously had no idea what was going on. But it was so different from their experience of birthing that they were looking for a reason, and the reason they came up with was blue cohosh. So they're writing about blue cohosh, and I call them fanboys because the literature was unbelievable. Oh, we love this herb. Everybody needs to know about this. This is going to save our women. It was really extreme. It was all over the place. Botanists, herbalists, everybody was writing about blue cohosh. They were missing a few things in this, and this is an example. This is an Indian remedy considered of great value, used postpartum or used during pregnancy and childbirth to facilitate childbirth. They drink this root from 2 to 3 weeks before labor. A matter of short duration and small concern. I love that. Having given birth to 4 children, three myself, I gave birth to. Right. As I said, some of what they saw they didn't quite understand, but they did see that it was apparently easier, and they credited this herb, which was partially true, because yes, blue cohosh is something that makes labor efficient. But they missed 2 things, right? So while the medicine women of the tribe would, in fact, keep these women on this tea made from the root, and the delivery was easier and swifter, 100%, and that is still used today. However, they missed 2 things. One, they missed how badly ergot had messed things up. And 2, they missed the curse of Eve. So European women were, and unfortunately still are, and now it's around the world, laboring under the curse of Eve, whose religion says, you shall give birth in travail and pain. Labor shall be painful. I mean, I'm totally misquoting the Garden of Eden, but I think if you know basically the way the story goes, that was you will labor to get food, and you will give birth in travail. So when the European women went into the birthing room to give birth, they were read their last rites. I think you can imagine what this does to you psychologically. Native American women, fortunately, did not know who Eve was and were not laboring under such nonsense as the curse of Eve. The same for African women. And of course, the people writing at the time didn't kind of think about how this may have affected the outcome of the process. But I am really glad that they found that, in fact, blue cohosh is great. It's wonderful for uterine contractions, and it's used very successfully. And this was written about over and over again. But let's talk about the more problematic ergot. And this is just super interesting to me, because ergot was being employed when men began to get into childbirth, partially as a destruction of traditional knowledge and traditional knowledge of medicinal herbs as a consequence of the destruction of the witches, right? All of the witch trials. The other consequence, or the other reason for this, was the introduction of technology into the birthing room. So traditionally, midwives went into the birthing room with other women to sit, wait, watch, and be supportive. Men entered the birthing room wanting to use equipment and wanting things to go quickly, and that's how ergot became used for making things go faster. Funny enough, women had used ergot, but it was used for very heavy menstrual periods and for the postpartum if the woman was bleeding. And so now you can go to any hospital, any obstetrics ward in any hospital, they still have a form of ergot there. It's called methogen. but we have hopefully learned how to use it judiciously. So a little bit, yes, could be good in stopping bleeding, but you use too much, and it was easy to do that, and you cause both the child and the uterine rupture, so you could cause the mother to die. And as I said, eventually it was discontinued as a labor stimulant and only used for excessive bleeding, which goes back to the already established wisdom of women and midwives in Europe. And all of these things have been researched. There's evidence of the use of ergot for excessive bleeding. I think, if I remember the research, going back to the 1600s. What does this tell us about blue cohosh? Well, one, it tells us that, yes, there was all this conversation about this relative to this very important event, which was childbirth, right? So that's one thing that it tells us about blue cohosh. The other thing is that maybe African American communities were also hearing about this, but it's not convincing, right? That research is there, but there were just a few references about that. I think absolutely. And I'll go into that in a minute of why I think absolutely. But the research itself was mostly between Native American use and European use of blue cohosh. I think the absolutely, and this is the actual citation, is because home remedies, medicinal herbs, the knowledge was being passed around through African healers, through their communities. That we do know. And so it's very likely that blue cohosh was as well. And what was going on is that during childbirth, and we will see this many times, and this is in the records, and partially because of the records that were kept by slave owners, which were a little bit more meticulous because this was an economic activity for them. You will see them report who is in the birthing room and who is in charge. And it's a very interesting space because across these boundaries, the person in charge of the birthing room could be from any of these groups. So if you knew that an enslaved woman had good outcomes in childbirth, she would come and attend all of the births in that community. The same for indigenous women in the community. If you knew that they had good outcomes, they would attend the births as the person in charge. And so you can imagine, and I know from actual experience, that if you're watching this person who's then giving plant medicines to the woman in labor, everybody in that room is learning that information. And that's where these epistemologies were negotiated. So evidence of sharing between Native and European communities is absolutely there, and with enslaved Africans, yes, we think so. But look at how this mirrors these complex histories and these cross-cultural communications, right? So for me, I was very happy to find this, not just because I knew blue cohosh, but I just thought, yeah, this is exactly what I was looking for, right? That's the whole point of this. We were able to look at this medicinal plant and find this fascinating information about cross-cultural communications. This next section, and I am going to go through this a little bit quickly because it's easy to go in depth on this topic, which I am very passionate about, but I want to go through this quickly because I want to get to the plant. And the plant that we're going to talk about is cotton. But in order to talk about cotton, we need to remember the following things about health justice, specifically the health justice, both historical and contemporary, for African American women. We're in a situation now where the health statistics for African American and indigenous, but especially African American women, are so horrendous they're equivalent to the health statistics, reproductive health statistics for a developing country. So what that means is Black women and children are dying in childbirth and in the postpartum. And so for me, it was, okay, what's going on? This, of course, is research that I'm passionate about, but also how does this relate now to cotton? So let's do a quick survey here. it starts with historical trauma like Saartjie Baartman, whose body was displayed and studied even after her death. So that's part of this historical trauma around Black women's reproductive health. It includes Anarcha, the slave of Dr. Marion Sims, she and some of her fellow enslaved community members were subject to experimental vaginal surgeries without anesthesia. It includes Mississippi appendectomies, but unnecessary hysterectomies performed teaching hospitals and without the permission or knowledge of the women. So two famous in the sense that they're well known in the community. Elaine Riddick was 13 years old when she was sterilized against her will and knowledge. And Fannie Lou Hamer, who's very important in the Black community, is another one of the 8,000 plus women and girls who got these sterilizations. It includes the Tuskegee study, and I could spend a lot of time on the Tuskegee study, and I won't. But if you think about the Tuskegee study, where 299 African American men were purposely infected with syphilis, studied and denied treatment, even after treatment became available during the time of this study. And they lured these illiterate sharecroppers with the US government. This is US government research. And they lured these illiterate sharecroppers into this study, and then withheld penicillin even after it became proven as a treatment for syphilis in 1947. And what I really want to get to is the fact that it was not just these men, but it was the 40 wives who contracted the disease from them and the 19 children who were born with congenital syphilis. Henrietta Lacks is a part of this historical trauma, and the fact that her cells were cloned without her permission or knowledge when she was 31. If you do any research in a laboratory and you have a science background, you have used the cells of Henrietta Lacks. They're called HeLa cells. I myself, when I was studying biology, had used them, and they have literally been distributed around the world now. And they were used in all of this different research, including most recently in our SARS-CoV or COVID-19 research. And yet she was penniless, and until recently when her family finally won a lawsuit, they were penniless. She didn't even have health care. And again, this is part of that historical trauma around Black communities, especially Black women. But as I said, the contemporary trauma, and this is two studies that I invite you to look at your leisure that came out in 2018, one about the American Indian community and the other about the Black community. African American women in the US are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth and pregnancy than white women. It doesn't matter what your economic situation is. It doesn't matter what your degree is. This is across that. An American Black woman with an advanced degree is more likely to lose her baby than a white American with less than 8th grade education. Two people talk about why. Sociologist David Williams talks about the role of discrimination from a sociological point of view and how that harms the health of Black women, and says we have a number of studies that look at the relationship between discrimination and poor health. And then Professor Arlene Geronimus, who looks at this at a cellular level, talks about being able to look at indications of cell destruction as a result of what she calls weathering, which is the discrimination and hardship and stress that prematurely deteriorates the bodies of African American women. And so her research is fascinating. She says the impact of dealing with disadvantage through the life wears down the body. This has nothing to do, although we tend to blame the mother, with how she was taking care of herself. Right? And then this is what Geronimus says. It's beyond anything an individual has control over. But the research that really riveted me here was the fact that this all happens within one generation. And I've cited the actual study here for you to look at. This was basically European mothers and African diaspora, I believe both Africa and the Caribbean, come to the United States. They looked at the health of their daughters, the reproductive health, and saw that when the daughters gave birth, while situation improved for European women, it deteriorated for women from the African diaspora. This is the study. It takes just one generation for this American black-white health disparity to manifest as a result of this discrimination. And as I said, we could go on. We could talk about Venus Williams, the famous tennis player who almost died in childbirth because of discrimination. It's a critical issue. Why? Okay, what does it have to do with this talk? Well, I found out while I was doing this research about cotton, and this is my last story, and then we're going to wrap up. And I was reading these archives, and I'm reading, these are the plants that are important to enslaved African Americans. Cotton is definitely on there, along with all of these other plants. But as I'm reading through the archives, I start seeing this conversation that I then wrote about between slave owners and doctors and botanists between the American South, Canada, Scotland, and the UK. And I'm reading the microfiche, and they're writing to each other. And the basic story is the plantation owners say that our slaves are drinking tea of cotton seeds and cotton root to induce an abortion. And why are they doing that? Because they're being forced to breed. And so we want to stop that because it's an economic loss for us. What can we do? So this is a conversation that's going on. And then one of them pipes up with the idea of, well, there's this other herb you can use called black haw, which will reduce the effects of the abortion. And so, first of all, everybody knew about cotton, and everybody knew that cotton was used for reproductive health. Cotton is one of those plants that's ubiquitous around the world. In fact, it's so ubiquitous, it's hard to tell, where the species originate from. Right? You really have to look deeply. And so everybody already knew to use this plant for women's reproductive health. And that's because of this substance in the cotton root called gossypol, which is also used today, both for birth control and for anti-cancer agents. But cotton, why cotton, right? And remember, cotton was single-handedly responsible for the turning of the slave trade from an international issue into a domestic issue. So as most of European countries were decreasing the part of the triangle trade having to do with getting and enslaving people from Africa to the Americas, there was an outcry in Europe, both moral and economic, about that. In the United States, the technology around cotton meant that there was an increase in laws enslaving African Americans domestically. So there's this, I'm reading this, and of course you can kind of imagine, I'm like, wow, this craziness that was going on. And the idea that physicians on both sides of the Atlantic from this period, the newspaper articles were from 1882 to 1886, were talking about their economic interests in slavery and trying to force breeding, but then force enslaved women to reverse the fact that they were using cotton for their own reproductive health. This for me was all of the stories rolled into one. It's a compelling irony, and it's just the symbolic meaning of this. And then when I compare this to historical injustice and contemporary injustice, this plant really did it for me. as you can imagine. I'm going to wrap up here. I'm talking about my favorite topics, so I could obviously go on and on. This research has been, it's been a pleasure to do this work for me, not the least of which it brings together all of my different interests. So I think what I'd like to end us with is the idea of these are some of the issues looking at American intercultural history. And these are the stories that I found in my research. And some of this is also about what is called in the literature decolonizing the mind. I call it epistemic plurality. And what does that mean? It means there are different ways of knowing the world, right? And I'm a scientist. I'm trained as a scientist. My first degree is in biology, and I know how globalizing Western science is. But I, as well, have had to learn to respect that is not the only way to know the world. And we keep making the case as in theory that it's not just about the relationships, the unequal power relationships, but it's also about these distorted power relationships around knowledge. And that's what decolonizing the mind is talking about. Coloniality, modernity, and this is an excellent book written by Dr. de Oliveira about modernity and coloniality, and the fact that certain ways of knowledge were and are privileged over other ways of knowledge. And I think this idea that we have different ways of knowing reality it's critical, and it's really important for me to respect that. I wanted to know how people obtained and exchanged their knowledge of the use of plant remedies across these complicated racial and cultural boundaries. And I wanted to know how this information evolved in this particular period of American history, 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s. I wanted to really look deeply at ethnobotany and the plants themselves as a way to help me understand the complexity of these interactions in this particular time that America is transforming so rapidly, and including the dispossession of Indigenous Americans and the trauma and enslavement of African Americans. And for me, I found that looking at these stories of plant medicines over this time did illuminate the multifaceted and very fraught ways in which our peoples were coming together, both transversing and maintaining these boundaries of culture and knowledge. The interactions that occurred around plant use for women's reproductive health are just a microcosm of the way people communicate and negotiate with each other, especially around environmental and, I should say, health issues. What we learned is that this information moves with people. So Africans did bring their knowledge, Europeans did bring their knowledge, but it also changes as people encounter each other. It's created from these negotiations, and one of the places that these negotiations happened was in the birthing room. And so I feel like the other thing that I really learned here is that ecological knowledge is both in place, depending on where you are, but it's also embodied and within culture, depending on where you come from. Racial and cultural boundaries were crossed through all of these things: trading, rituals, ceremony, etc., adoption, intermarriage, but specifically they were crossed in the childbirth room. And the birthing room formed a unique social space, as Lynn Kennedy says, where issues of control and power were less defined, and the skill of the person in charge, the woman in charge, was valued over the identity of that person. And for me, that's just a profound thing to say and to discover and to understand, to think about. So finally, knowing that both white and Black midwives were attending births in these female-directed rooms, and knowing that they were sharing information, and I know that because I have been in those rooms, I know what happens in the birthing room. We talk and we listen and we're watching what everybody is doing and we're learning. I found out that, yes, this was a secret life of medicinal plants that led to this incredible opportunity to communicate across cultures in a very fraught time in American history. So thank you for listening to me.